From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
It's no surprise that so many kids are being susceptible to this because it is a cocktail that is just too much for a young brain to understand and to cope with properly. So parents have a huge responsibility to be aware of this and be up to date on the impacts and implications if their kids are consuming this type of thing.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Margaret Olohan, author of the new book, Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. We'll talk in depth with Margaret later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Courtney Meyet. She is Chairwoman and Associate Professor of Chemistry here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Meyet, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Last time we talked about bicycling, cycling. But at the beginning of the program, this is years ago at this point, we were talking about a helium shortage in the U.S. Recently, though, comes news from Minnesota about a big helium find. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It has been a while since we talked about the helium shortage. And guess what? There's still a helium shortage. No, it was interesting to me to find out recently that the U.S. sold off its strategic reserve of helium, and this was in Texas, which has about 30% of the country's helium. So that obviously resulted in a short supply for our own country's needs. So this discovery in Minnesota might help with these shortages. These helium reserves have normally been found in the Great Plains, so Minnesota's a little further north. So I think it came as somewhat of a surprise, but it's timely. It's at the right moment that we need this.
I know you're not a mining expert, but how quickly can something like this impact the market and help alleviate some of that shortage? Yeah,
I mean, it's unclear. So if we could just go in and take it out, we do have the technology for that. But before the extraction can take place, it's also important to consider environmental concerns. And, the reserves of helium are heavily controlled by legislatures. So there's been a lot of discussion concerning regulatory measures that should be in place when large deposits like this are found. And I did read that there was a temporary permit that had been issued so that we can reap some of the benefits immediately. But as far as the mass extraction, it's unclear when this will happen.
We hear a lot about the importance of heavy metals, lithium, or even copper, particularly when it comes to electric vehicles and their production. How would you compare the importance of a proper helium supply here in the U.S.?
Right. Well, I mean, unfortunately, with metals, we do have to rely on other countries for their supply. What's nice about helium supplies is that our country happens to be sitting on one of the largest deposits known on Earth. And so for that, we are very fortunate that we can control it and we do have access to it as long as we don't sell them off, and of course, that's not the case with all natural resources.
Talking with Dr. Courtney Meyet, Chairwoman, Associate Professor of Chemistry here at Hillsdale College, about a recent helium find in Minnesota. Here's the sciencey part. Helium has unique chemical properties. What are they, and why is helium so important in the world of science? Yeah,
so helium is really an interesting element. It is the first noble gas in the periodic table. Of all the elements, it has the lowest boiling point. So to put it in terms that everyone, I think, can understand, that would be negative 452 degrees Fahrenheit. So you think about how cold that is. That's the boiling point of liquid helium. It's the second most abundant element. So, right, we're talking about this being rare, but in the observable universe, it is the second most abundant element next to hydrogen, and it's produced by the nuclear fusion of hydrogen in stars. But it's not really practical to try to extract helium from space. So we do get our helium from the Earth. Interesting story about helium. It was first discovered in 1868 by Pierre Janssen and Norman Lockyer. Interesting story. Both of these gentlemen they had observed helium as a yellow line in the spectrum. So it's called the D3 line, and it's near the sodium emission. So they saw this coming from spectrums that were taken near the edge of the sun. They published their findings independently, but their papers reached the French Academy on the same day. So they are both credited with the discovery of helium. Lockyer actually named the element helium, which comes from the Greek word helios, meaning sun. On Earth, it is rare, though. It can be emitted during radioactive decay of uranium ore and also thorium, and it can be also found in large natural gas fields. And in gas fields, it accounts for approximately 7% of the volume that can be extracted by fractional distillation. And it's also important here to note that terrestrial helium is considered a non-renewable resource, meaning that like once it's out, it's gone. And, we can understand that by, every time a child loses a helium balloon, right. It goes up into the sky and it's gone. Same thing with the gas. It goes up into space and we will never see it again. So the actual terrestrial helium was discovered also as a spectral line, and that was emanating from uranium ores. So this resulted in a Nobel Prize. This was given to William Ramsay for chemistry in 1904. And then in 1903, interestingly, vast amounts of helium were found under the Great Plains of the United States. And this was noted and investigated because there was a gas geyser that would not burn because it's a noble gas. It's an inert gas. It is unreactive. Mm-hmm.
People do connect helium with balloons, children's parties, but I know there's far more use for it in the scientific world. How is helium used in research? What are its applications?
So, what we probably are most concerned with the helium shortage is the use of MRIs. So MRIs use superconducting magnets. These need to be kept near absolute zero, which, obviously is going to require the coldest element that we can find, which is helium. So this is really the best choice of element to keep these magnets cool. Other uses in scientific research for helium, like an MRI and research in my department, we use something called an NMR, a nuclear magnetic resonance instrument. And this works much like an MRI, also has a cooled or superconducting magnet. The other uses of helium would be in arc welding, crystal growth for silicon wafers. Also, it is a really important coolant for satellites and space telescopes, and it's a carrier gas for many of the analytical instruments that we use in research.
The shortage we've talked about in helium, how has it affected various industries or even various scientific opportunities the past few years? And are there other measures that can be taken to address the issue while perhaps we wait for some of this helium to become usable?
I would think probably the greatest issue is with shortage comes great cost. So as the cost increases of helium, the ability for hospitals and industry to maintain their instrumentation, it diminishes. They've either got to cut something out to keep their instrumentation running with helium, or they decommission an instrument. So it is a concern. And, helium shortage is not going to go away. It's most likely always going to be a concern. When we find a new deposit, it helps for a little while, but soon we're going to run through that and we're going to be looking for more.
So with that said, are there alternative technologies? Are there different methods that might be used or scientific advances developed to help reduce our helium dependence or reduce the needs we have for helium?
Yeah, so there are some technologies that are emerging. First, which I think is probably most important, is when helium is actually extracted, that process has to be fine-tuned because there are losses that are incurred from the extraction from natural sources. And then so minimizing the release there is key. Another place that we lose helium, of course, is with the use in these large instruments. So there's a high boil-off rate of helium when MRIs are used, when NMRs are used, when it's being used for the cooling of various instruments. So if there's a way to trap that boil-off, contain it, compress it again, and then recirculate it back into instruments, that would be incredibly valuable and cost effective. Probably not initially when you set something up, but over the long term, to be able to save that helium, recycle that helium would be incredibly valuable. And so there are institutions and industry that are already using this technology, but it is not widespread. Some of it is very good. And, this kind of research, this kind of trapping of helium, it is in the earlier stages, but I suspect as we continue on in this shortage that there will be, more incentive to fine-tune this method of trapping helium.
Is it okay if we continue to buy balloons?
I don't know. I mean, if you think of one balloon, and the helium in just this one tiny balloon, compared to the vast amount of cool compressed helium that we use for instruments, I would say maybe it's okay. But, it is something that I think we need to look at and be concerned about. I think the massive use of helium for party supplies, maybe we can find other ways to celebrate, All
right. That's more research.
Right.
Research. Dr. Courtney Meyet is Chairwoman and Associate Professor of Chemistry at Hillsdale College. Dr. Meyet, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, Mary Margaret Olohan joins us. Her new book, Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Classical music is one of the greatest achievements of Western civilization. It took 2,000 years and the work of the greatest philosophic, scientific, political, and religious minds to properly tune the piano and make great music possible. But listening to classical music can be intimidating. In Hillsdale College's new, free online course, The History of Classical Music, Pythagoras through Beethoven, you'll learn how to appreciate humanity's transcendent musical accomplishments. In the history of classical music, concert pianist and Hillsdale College Distinguished Fellow Hyperion Knight explains how music has developed and what distinguishes the greatest musical achievements of Western civilization. The history of classical music will help students, both novices and aficionados, appreciate the beauty of classical music. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to join us on Facebook. Search for the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. We're joined by Mary Margaret Olohan. She is senior reporter at the Daily Signal and also author of the brand new book, Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. Mary Margaret, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
The book tells the stories of 4 women, mostly, and 3 men later on, who are real-life victims of the gender ideology cult and transitioning. I want to ask about that word, though, victims. Would you call them victims? And if so, why?
I would absolutely call them victims of this gender ideology cult. And I would actually call their parents victims of the cult as well, because these are people who were suffering from severe mental health issues that deserved help, they deserved compassion, they deserved care. And instead, when they went to mental health professionals seeking help, they were told that they were in the wrong body, that they would be happier if they underwent surgical and hormonal transition procedures, and that their happiness did depend on going through these really horrific, invasive procedures. And so ultimately, these were people who were lied to. They were betrayed by the medical community. And once their eyes were open to the fact that they had been betrayed in this manner and they tried to speak out about it, they were absolutely cast aside by the people who formerly embraced them. And so, yes, I would call them victims, but at the same time, I think I and many others have been really impressed by their bravery in speaking up and in sharing their stories and in articulating what they have been through so that other people don't go down that same path.
So why structure the book in this manner where it is essentially a storytelling book? You're looking into the lives of these four women mostly, and again, a few men later on in the book, and allowing them to tell what they experienced through this, I guess we'll call it a journey. Why structure the book in this way?
I structured it like this because initially I thought about telling their stories one by one. And as I started to write the book, I thought, no, that's not the right way to do it, because I want people to understand that these girls are going through these stages in very similar ways. And I wanted to interweave their stories together to help people understand how truly hard and traumatic this experience was for so many girls. And it is an ongoing problem for many people, even today. But I thought that it was a better way to structure it, in that weaving their stories together would help people understand the magnanimity of what they were going through, and to, rather than have individual stories one by one, to help people understand the different stages as they are together.
Can you briefly introduce us to our main characters that we meet throughout Detrans?
Yes, so our main characters are Prisha Mosley, Helena Kirshner, Abel Garcia, Luca Hine, and Chloe Cole. And, we also talk about Walt Hayer a little bit and a young man named Richie. But I really dwell the most, I would say, on the five individuals: Luca, Prisha, Helena, Chloe, and Abel. And these are all individuals who began transitioning or attempting to transition in the age of social media. And I document how social media really affected all of them, how it pushed them towards transition, and the different ways in which it did that. We talk about pornography and its effects on these young people, the different social media platforms, Tumblr, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok I get into a little bit, but we don't even fully know the impacts of TikTok on kids in regards to gender ideology, because it's a fairly newer platform. So that's something that I'll be looking into in the future. But Chloe, Luca, Prisha, Abel, and Helena are all individuals who began believing that they were in the wrong body based on the input of gender activists and people online. And they were struggling. They had mental health issues. They felt lonely and awkward in their social climate. Many of them most of them actually believed they were on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. And when they went to get these mental health issues diagnosed, instead of receiving proper feedback and proper help, they were told that they probably were in the wrong body and they should begin this transition process.
Mary Margaret Olohan is with us. Her book, Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. There's a chapter on encouragement, and you mentioned social media and its effect. What do you feel that they got from social media that perhaps they weren't getting or couldn't get elsewhere in their lives at that moment?
Oh, it's really truly sad, because these are young people who were looking for companionship. They were looking for identity, for people who cared about them and affirmed them. And unfortunately for people like Chloe was a young adolescent. She was not fitting in well at school. Her siblings were too much older than her for her to really find companionship with them, and she was lonely. And so she was seeking affirmation and companionship And I think this plays into a larger problem in our society today, in that many, many people are struggling with a lack of understanding of who they are and why they're even on this earth in the first place. And I would argue that part of that has to do with a lack of faith in our culture and a lack of understanding of where we came from and why we're here and what our purpose is. But I think this is a cultural phenomenon that you see where many people are struggling to understand these questions. And for a child who is trying to figure out her identity and is basing a lot of that off of superficial things that she's told that she should base it off of on social media, such as appearance and followers and friends, that can be really, really hard. And we've already seen the Wall Street Journal, I believe, document how horrific the effects of social media are on the mental health of young people, setting aside gender, just truly detrimental to the psyche of young people, especially girls. And when you throw gender ideology into the mix there, it's no surprise that so many kids are being susceptible to this, because it is a cocktail that it's just too much for a young brain to understand and to cope with properly. So parents have a huge responsibility to be aware of this and be up to date on the impacts and implications if their kids are consuming this type of thing.
Mary Margaret, what about the role of therapists? And perhaps we can confine this only to the situations that you know directly through these stories. But should these therapists be grouped under this heading of encouragement? Are they the ones in these cases who are pushing these girls farther down the path of transitioning?
Absolutely. I did not, none of the young people that I spoke with for this book met with a therapist that didn't affirm them. And I guess that's a double negative there. So I'll just say that more simply. Every therapist that these people met with affirmed them and told them they were in the wrong body. And that's truly stunning, because our therapists theoretically should be a huge help to those struggling. They should be a barrier in between this type of tragedy. But instead, for someone like Prisha, who is suffering from crippling anorexia and a host of other mental health issues, when she met with her therapist, that therapist affirmed her and affirmed her delusions that she was receiving from gender activists, that she was a boy, not a girl, and that her desire to get away from her feminine body was proof that she was, in fact, a boy. And this therapist also was a very large part of convincing Prisha's parents that this was the right move for her, that she should go down this path. And that therapist is named in Prisha's lawsuit as someone who absolutely pushed her down this path towards transition that she largely cannot take back.
Mary Margaret Olohan with us, her book Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. You've mentioned parents a few times, including labeling them as victims early on in our conversation. There are stories from Detrans about parents accompanying these girls to appointments and conversations. A question posed to one of them, would you prefer a live son or a dead daughter? If people look at these situations, Mary Margaret, and ask, how could these parents allow this, or how could these parents permit this to happen to their daughter? How would you explain that?
I would explain it as, this is an unprecedented obstacle for our parents. Parents have faced many hardships over the centuries, but I would argue that this one is a particularly unique challenge, where a young person comes to their parents and says, I'm a boy, I'm not a girl, and I need to go through these procedures because the doctors and gender activists I'm talking to online say that I'm not going to be happy unless I do it. Most of the parents' gut reaction is, this is insane. I don't want my child to go on hormones. I don't want my daughter, my beautiful little girl, to get a double mastectomy. That doesn't seem right to me. But they're not totally sure how to handle this. And perhaps they're not super politically savvy. They're not tuned into the debate on this topic. And so they do what many other parents have done, is they seek the help of medical professionals. They seek the help of therapists and counselors and and doctors and other mental health professionals. And unfortunately, what we're finding is that in almost all cases, they're told to affirm their child, and that if they don't affirm their child will probably kill themselves, which is a lie. But it's a lie that's being told to many, many parents. And the specific line they are given is, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son? Or if we're talking about a boy, would you rather have a dead son or a living daughter? And that's a threat. That's a threat to the parents saying, if you don't comply, your child will die. And it's a very, very evil thing to say to a parent who loves their child and wants to help them. But it's effective because many of these parents from then on decide, I don't want my child to die. I want to do what's best for my child. And so they go along with this. And I will say that these parents absolutely have an obligation to do more research, that, in the age of the internet, there are certainly resources for them to access that would help them understand that they are being lied to. But in many cases, they're not in a place where they can find these resources, or they're not connected with the right people that can help them understand what's going on. And one of the most tragic parts of this whole madness is that when they have this gut instinct, they're encouraged to look away from their gut instincts and to go with this ideology over facts and science. And Luca, one of the detransitioners in the book, she told me recently that, and I don't think I included this in the book because I didn't know it until later. She told me that when she realized that she had made a mistake and she was detransitioning, she had to call her mom and tell her. And she said this was one of the most horrible conversations she's ever had, because her mother had begged her not to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so she had to call her mother, and they both sobbed as she said, you were right. Your gut was right. I shouldn't have done any of this, and I regret it. And I think that's just excruciating, to have to acknowledge to the parent, you were right. Your gut was right. You should have listened to it. And, I don't think Luca was holding it against her mother. But I'm sure that's something the mother will have to grapple with for the rest of her life, is that if she had trusted her instincts, her daughter would be safe. So it's truly an unprecedented obstacle for modern parents, and not something that parents should have to deal with. But unfortunately, this is the times that we live in, and so my hope is that this book and other resources will be a good resource to parents who, perhaps they're not conservative and perhaps they're more left-leaning, but they can access the stories of people who have tried to undergo these procedures and understand that this is not the answer, and that children deserve time. They deserve to go through an unhindered puberty, and they deserve to not be betrayed by their medical system.
Mary Margaret Olohan with us, her book Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. I want to return to the realization phase in a moment, but there are, of course, real, brutal descriptions of what these girls went through when they transitioned. There's a lot of focus on the surgical procedures, rightfully so. But what struck me, Mary Margaret, was the descriptions of what happened to these girls, these teenagers, 16 years old, at least one of them 16 years old. What happened when they began taking the doses of testosterone? In their words, what did they experience as that began?
Well, in Chloe's words, she described a honeymoon phase where initially she felt really, really good. And I think this is partially due to the fact that when she was on puberty blockers, before she was on testosterone, she had no hormones in her body. Because when you're on puberty blockers, the point of them is to stop and halt your puberty. And it very much strips you of the hormones that are in your system. And so when she began taking testosterone, she had this rush of hormones and so much energy. She felt amazing. And she, of course, like many other young girls who have gone through this, would tell their friends, I feel so good. This is great. The testosterone is making me so happy. And that's part of the reason that we have such a huge social contagion problem with this matter. But very shortly afterwards, she began to experience the physical and mental side effects. Some of these physical side effects include hair loss, hair in places that she was not expecting, hair growth in places she was not expecting. Her skin was coarser. Her muscles began to change. Her bone density began to change. Now her shoulders are too heavy for her body, and she has all kinds of weird aches and pains. And emotionally, she and others told me that they felt insane and very, very strong rage urges, to the point where they felt like they had to physically manifest this rage. For Helena, she would punch things and had all these bruises all over her body from just trying to externalize this rage she was feeling. They also had a very far increased sex drives that they did not know what to do with, that they had never experienced before. Similarly, some of these girls lost the ability to cry. So they would feel this really strong urge to cry and need to emote in that fashion, but just couldn't happen. And that was really hard for them. One thing I found particularly scary is some of them lost the ability to scream. Mm-hmm. And for many women, that's a reoccurring nightmare where, you are trying to get away from someone, or you're trying to save someone and you open your mouth to scream and nothing comes out. That is a reality for many of these girls who tried to transition and were on testosterone. So these are just some of the physical and mental side effects that they have had to deal with. And, as they detransition, some of these side effects have lessened and some of them have increased. I know, for example, Prisha is able to sing a little bit again. She had lost the ability to sing for a while, which was really sad for her because she formerly had a beautiful high operatic voice and she loved to sing. Now she says she can a little bit, but it's just slowly coming back. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that these hormones and the surgeries are very experimental in nature. We don't know their full effects, and we won't know their full effects for quite some time. And the doctors and therapists who are recommending them also don't know their full effects. And when I say that, I mean we don't know their full negative effects on the human body. We found out recently through the expose of the WPATH files, the World Professional Transgender Health Association, that these so-called experts were aware that testosterone was causing tumors in some girls, that testosterone was making some girls infertile, that these so-called experts were aware that some of these young people were so mentally ill that they could not properly consent to these procedures. And yet they're sweeping all of this under the rug and publicly proclaiming the efficacy of gender-affirming care because that fits the narrative right now. So it's a truly horrific situation where we have these experimental treatments being pushed on young people. And meanwhile, the experts that are being heralded by many, many media outlets in the United States are aware that they're harmful and dangerous.
This realization point, Mary Margaret, when they perhaps understand that this is not going to help them, this is not going to solve their problems, as Helena asks, what if my mental health is not improving? What if I'm not feeling any different? It took them perhaps a long time to get to a point where they are transitioning. What gets them over the point where they want to detransition?
I think for many of them, the point comes when they realize, I've been through this surgery, I've been through these hormones, I don't feel better. And for many of them, that's a realization point because they were told so aggressively, if you do this, you will be happy. If you get this surgery, you will feel like a boy. Your gender dysphoria will resolve. There was all this promises that they would feel better. And of course, since their mental health issues were not actually addressed and were only exacerbated by these procedures that were done to them, when they come out the other side and they don't feel better, for many of them, that's kind of the awakening moment because they realize, oh my gosh, I don't feel better. And that was the promise. So what if everything else was a lie too? And from there on out, there's kind of a slow process of stopping taking the hormones, which, I think some people think that people who are trying to transition take hormones for a little while and then stop. No, the idea is that you take them for the rest of your life if you want to fully live as another gender, which you can't actually do. But you will be taking them for many, many, many years. So for the detransitioners who are trying to stop, they'll slowly wean themselves off of the hormones. They'll try and begin subtly living as their their biological sex again, and subtly changing things like going by their real pronouns, etc. But it's a traumatic time for them. It's a slow realization that many of the things that they have hinged their entire personality and identity on were completely fabricated. And they're already suffering with mental health issues. So it's a dangerous point in their lives, and it's a scary point for many of them. I think Abel was saying that he resorted to some substances when he was struggling to deal with his detransition. And I'm grateful that all of the people who were in my book came out the other side and, are okay. And, they're still rebuilding their lives to a certain extent, but they spoke out. They're willing to share their stories with the world and help people understand what they had been through, because they didn't have anyone to look to when they were going through this. They didn't have anyone that was speaking out. And so now they're being the voices for the next generation of young people who might be susceptible to this. And I'm very grateful to them for that.
One final question for Mary Margaret Olohan. Her new book is Detrans. People might look and point and say this is just a small number of girls who have detransitioned, and the vast majority of people are happy and they stay in their new gender. You point out in the book, though, it's very hard to know the true number of detransitioners because many don't self-report. They don't tell their doctors. They're embarrassed about the whole situation. How big of a movement do you think this actually is?
It's really hard to say because, yes, I think researcher Lisa Littman did a study where she found that only 24% of the detransitioners she interviewed actually went back to their doctors and said, we regretted our gender transition. That's a very small number, and I would guess that this number is growing even more, the number of detransitioners who are not speaking up. Because they're treated so savagely by the transgender community, it's no surprise to me that they would not want to put their names and faces out there. But I'm thankful for the growing number of lawsuits, the growing amount of legislation all over the country protecting kids, and the high-profile nature that some of these detransitioners have reached, because I think their stories are the most powerful in combating this gender ideology, and will have the most sway when it comes to convincing other young people that this is not the route they should take.
Mary Margaret Olohan, you can read her work at the Daily Signal, where she is a senior reporter, and her new book is out now, Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult. Mary Margaret, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
Up next, we hear excerpts from the recent Hillsdale College commencement address given by Pat Sajak. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Great books, great people, and great ideas. Knowledge of these things is critical to becoming a well-educated human being. That's why I'd like to tell you about an easy and enjoyable way for you to listen and learn whenever and wherever you want. And that's through the Hillsdale Dialogues. If you haven't heard about the Dialogues, once a week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins radio veteran Hugh Hewitt to discuss topics of enduring relevance. From time to time, they also talk about current events, but always with an eye toward more fundamental truths. And they want you to listen in, to join a conversation like no other. The Hillsdale Dialogues are posted every Friday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you get your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. You'll find older episodes of this program along with other great Hillsdale College audio. We now hear excerpts from the commencement address from the 172nd Spring Commencement Ceremony at Hillsdale College, which took place on May 11th. The commencement speaker, Pat Sajak, host of Wheel of Fortune from 1981 through 2024. He has served on Hillsdale's Board of Trustees since 2022, as vice chairman from 2003 to 2019, and chairman since 2019. Sajak began his address by talking about his experience with Hillsdale's academics.
In 2008, after having served about 5 years on the board, I began to feel a little strange about not having a college degree. I talked to Dr. Arn, and we devised a plan to get me there gradually, starting with the dreaded core. Back then, Hillsdale wasn't really set up for any meaningful online learning, so a number of professors, some of whom are here today, began quietly taping their lectures and uploading them so that I could listen to them. I did the papers, I took the exams, I occasionally checked in person. It was a lot of extra work for these professors, but they did it willingly and cheerfully, and I will be forever grateful to them. And I don't know if they're all here today. I'm going to mention 3 folks, and I'd like to acknowledge them now. So for guiding me through the rigors of English and Shakespeare, for taking me along the winding, twisting roads of history, and for sharing the beauty of the U.S. Constitution, would you please help me publicly thank 3 amazing men, Dr. Steve Smith, Dr. Brad Berzer, and Dr. Larry Arn. Would you please stand? Thank you, guys. You guys are really tough on me. 2 quick epilogues. The Constitution course was new to the core, so I was kind of a guinea pig for it. There were lengthy weekly papers and telephonic discussions and lots of reading. A little while later, Dr. Arn apologized to me, saying that he had assigned what he called an unconscionable amount of work, and as a result, they actually modified the load for future classes. You're welcome. The end of the story is this. Because my original college was unaccredited at the time, I had to retake a lot of courses once I finished the core, including the sciences. So I dutifully bought all the textbooks, chemistry and physics and such, and I visited the labs to work out an in-person schedule. Then I opened the books. I read about 1.5 pages, and I quickly decided that since I had made it this far without a degree, maybe the core was enough. So I stand before you, an aspiring college graduate who was ultimately defeated by biology, chemistry, and physics. So there you go.
He continued by reflecting on his job as host of Wheel of Fortune, the final episodes which aired just a few weeks ago.
As some of you may know, this is my final season on the TV game show Wheel of Fortune. I've done it for over 40 years, and I felt this might be a good time to move on. My final week of shows airs starting Monday, June 3rd. In fact, I recorded my last episode some weeks ago, and I made an interesting discovery. When you stop recording shows, they stop sending checks. I had no idea. I thought I might be grandfathered in or something, but we'll be okay. One of the things I miss most about doing the show is meeting our contestants. When you work in Hollywood, it's easy to forget that there's a big, wide country out there filled with wonderful people, all kinds of people. It's the same feeling I get on my visits to this campus. And like students here, our players care about each other, they pull for each other, they're proud of their families and their hometowns and their jobs and their schools and their pets, especially their pets. I can't tell you how many times players will mention they have 3 kids without naming any of them, but they name each one of their dogs. Like the dogs are going to call, I can't believe my owner mentioned me on TV the other day. But pets aside, meeting these players was always kind of a tonic for me, an antidote to some of the nastiness you find online, in media, in our political discourse, on many of our campuses, and in so much of our daily lives. You can read a recipe for chocolate chip cookies on a website and then scroll down through the comments, and by about comment number 4, somebody is threatening someone else with bodily harm.
We're listening to excerpts from Pat Sajak's commencement address from the 2024 commencement ceremony at Hillsdale College. Sajak talks now about the breakdown of civility in culture.
I'm always reluctant to get into the world is falling apart mode because people my age have always felt the world is falling apart. My parents were certain that Elvis Presley meant the end of Western civilization, and I'm sure distant relatives of mine railed against everything from the telegraph to talking pictures. But there does seem to be something more insidious going on this time. Blame it on our politics, on social media, on COVID, on our education establishment, or whichever you think the guilty entity might be. But there does seem to be a growth in animosity between and among individuals. It's not enough to disagree, you also have to disparage. Every issue has competing camps, and if you're not with us, you're against us. Your views make you unworthy of my friendship. there is a coarseness that has taken hold in our exchanges with each other, a coarseness that is not only excused, it is often celebrated. In short, our breakdown is a breakdown of civility. It's a breakdown of manners in speech and action. It's a breakdown of respectful and courteous interactions. And it goes to the very heart of why the world seems so upside down now. And this lack of civility becomes self-perpetuating, a kind of whirlwind that continuously grows in intensity. And I fear for us if we don't find a way to slow this whirlwind down, because America cannot function if it's merely a disparate collection of causes and hardened viewpoints that don't allow for discussion or compromise. It cannot function without a return to civility.
He continues by encouraging the class of 2024 to practice civility in all parts of life.
Those of you graduating today have so much to offer the world, whether it's in business, healthcare, education, raising a family, or 100 other ways. Your Hillsdale education and the values you learned here will make this country and this world a better place. But I humbly ask that you also strive to practice civility in everything you do. And it won't be as easy as it was here at Hillsdale, where civility always reigns. People who don't share your beliefs are going to have things to say. They may think you stupid or evil for even holding those beliefs. You'll have to negotiate the fine line between standing up for what you believe and returning their incivility in kind. But civility is the only chance we have to even begin to bridge these gaps. We can't keep out-shouting each other. Decibels don't win arguments, but knowledge does, and patience does, and kindness does. Anger, rage, and tantrums cannot defeat the good, the true, and the beautiful. A young Greek philosopher, contemporary fellow named Giannis Dolomitos said that in speaking with civility, that is with courtesy and respect, you are offering a wonderful gift to yourself, a useful embarrassment to the unkind, and a good example to bystanders. Samuel Johnson warned nearly 300 years ago that once the forms of civility are violated, there remains little hope of a return to kindness or decency. I'm a little embarrassed to say when I was thinking about these remarks, I was completely unaware, this is absolutely true, May is actually International Civility Awareness Month. Happy May. I'm always a little skeptical of these months or weeks or days dedicated to causes or products. After all, January 10th is Houseplant Appreciation Day. September is National Honey Month. I have no trouble with the idea of highlighting civility for a month, but civility is a bit different from houseplants or honey. A day, a week, a month won't do it, and we don't need to celebrate it. We need to practice it.
We're listening to excerpts from Pat Sajak's commencement address at Hillsdale College's commencement ceremony on May 11th. He concludes by telling our graduates, learning never stops.
I'd like to end with this. If there's one thing I found out on my circuitous educational journey is that learning need never and should never stop. Your degrees are of great value and signs of magnificent accomplishments, but they don't represent the end of learning. In some ways, they are just the beginning. And who knows, one day I may get the courage to take those science books off the shelf, dust them off, open them up, and get past the first page and a half. And then maybe I'll have the privilege of saying what you can all say today. I am graduating from the finest liberal arts college in America. Thank you all. God bless you.
That was Pat Sajak, the 2024 commencement speaker at Hillsdale College's 172nd Spring Commencement Ceremony. Pat, the longtime host of Wheel of Fortune and current chairman of Hillsdale College's Board of Trustees. That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Courtney Meyet from Hillsdale's Chemistry Department, Mary Margaret Olohan. Her new book is Detrans, True Stories of Escaping the Gender Ideology Cult, and we heard excerpts from the commencement address by Pat Sajak. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.